Hey everyone, we're back with part 2 of our hydraulic forming class. So today we are covering what I like to call the basics. First of all, we're going to focus on process and we're going to be talking about coining versus forming. We're going to do that using pattern plates first to start, both on the press and on the rolling mill. And we're going to do a few more demos. And then we're going to get into bending and forming metal using mushroom formers and Daps. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the first step we're going to get into is using disc cutters on the press. Now these Swanstrom disc cutters are really amazing tools. Use them all the time with a hammer. The beauty of the press is it allows you to cut a little bit cleaner and it allows you to cut much thicker gauges without, having to really use a lot of force from a hammer. So we're going to go ahead and cut a disc that we can then go ahead and form in the press. So first step is I have a piece of 28 gauge sterling silver and I have my punch here for my Swanstrom disc cutter. That is, I think, about 1.1 1/4 diameter. Now when using these, I'm going to put our metal in here, but what we want to do is use a shim that's the same gauge of metal on the other side. So we have these nice little shim kits that have a bunch of different gauges. That way I can easily go ahead and find my 28 gauge and put it in opposite the silver here. I'm going to go ahead and tighten this down. And then I want to go ahead and take my punch and a little bit of burr life and just give a slight bit of lubricant on there. That'll help this cut much cleaner. Now that fits nicely in there and it's ready to press. Okay, so now I've got this all ready to press. We need to go ahead and set up the press. First off, I have my master tool holder. This has 2 drilled and tapped holes on it, and we're going to go ahead and bolt this to the 2 outer holes of the top platen. And now we have our Swanstrom extension punch. So this is a nice punch made by Swanstrom. It's got a magnet on one side and it's going to go up right in there. This is going to allow us to press on the punch without breaking the handle. I'm going to go ahead and tighten that down. Now this slides up into there and I'll just give it a quick little squish. Now you want to be careful about this. You want to be slow when you're working through this. You don't want to just slam this punch and your metal all the way down into the platen of the press. And there you go. I have my nice little 28 gauge disc cut out. So that's how we're going to use this on the press. We always want to make sure to use a shim, get this handle nice and tight, make sure everything's really clean, and make sure there's a little bit of burr life on the punch. Okay, so now using rolling mill plates, pattern plates for embossing is a really great technique for working with really thin metals. Every process we go through, there's going to be pros and cons. And so while this might not be the perfect technique for certain things, it's a perfect technique for other things. So in this case, working with thin gauge metal and wanting to form it with a really nice, intricate pattern, this is a great way to do it. So I've got a really cool pattern plate here. I've got my silver, and I have a 1/16 inch thick piece of polyurethane. Now, when I'm working with any process that uses polyurethane, I always want to use an appropriate thickness for what I'm doing. This is very shallow forming. There's not a lot of depth to this, so I only want to use as much urethane as I need to get a full form here. So the 1/16 inch thick red polyurethane is the thinnest. This is going to be ideal. Now, that essentially is my whole setup. So what we want to do is go ahead and use aluminum spacer blocks. Top one, we're going to bolt up into the press. And then got my bottom one here. I'm going to get my disc lined up. polyurethane on top, and I'm going to slide that into the press. Now all I need to do is go ahead and press this. It's going to take a fair amount of pressure, so I'm going to go ahead and give it a full like 6,000 to 8,000 psi right away, and that should fully form it. We'll see. Now, one way that we can tell that this is forming is if we look at the front side, it's got good, nice detail. We look at the back side, and that's going to be the reverse of that same thing. So essentially, we're just bending the sheet over the peaks and valleys of that piece. So now we've got here a really nice detailed piece of 28 gauge silver. It's also pretty rigid, so this is a great technique to be using for using this as a background for something that we want to be light, like a pendant or earrings. And again, this technique is called forming, because what we're doing is we're taking flat sheet and we're just bending it over the ridges and valleys of this plate using polyurethane as our mating die, essentially. So embossing on these plates really works better with thinner material. We're going to go ahead and do a quick demo using some 18 gauge brass. Now, the thicker the metal is in forming, the stronger a bridge across our dies that it's going to create. In this case, pretty small detailed design. This 18 gauge brass is so thick that it's really going to resist bending over those peaks and valleys. I'm going to go ahead, we're going to throw this in the press with some red 95 durometer urethane, 1/16 of an inch thick again, and we're going to take it up to the same pressure that we did with the 28 gauge silver. Now you can see here really the difference in that texture and in that detail. So this shows much nicer, crisper detail. The lines are fully domed. And this you can see there's a lot more lacking. If we look at the reverse side too, we're going to see a really big difference there. So again, this technique, really one of the pros is working with thin metal and making it pretty strong and rigid. Works really well when you're wanting to make something lightweight or when you're working with expensive high carat gold, for example. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to take this same pattern plate and we're going to use it on the rolling mill. Now, when we're working with these pattern plates on the rolling mill, it's a completely different process. That is what is called coining. So we're going to be working with thicker metal, and using the pressure exerted by the rolling mill, we're actually going to be coining, extruding our metal into the face of this plate. So a lot of times you'll hear that you don't want to use a pattern plate that you've used in the rolling mill on the hydraulic press. And the reason behind that is after using pattern plate for a long time on the rolling mill, you'll get a lot of curvature to it. You can see this has been used a few times, but it's nice and flat. So what happens is when we get this much curvature, it's just going to kind of get in the way on the press. We're not going to get a good impression. Things are going to move around. It's really just not a good idea. So it is best to keep your plates nice and flat if you're going to be using them on the hydraulic press. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to take this same pattern plate and we're going to use it on the rolling mill. Now, when we're working with these pattern plates on the rolling mill, it's a completely different process. That is what is called coining. So we're going to be working with thicker metal, and using the pressure exerted by the rolling mill, we're actually going to be coining, extruding our metal into the face of this plate. All right, let's go ahead and use one of our pattern plates to roller print this piece of 18 gauge brass. Now, this process of coining, where we're actually extruding and restructuring the metal into our die, we want our metal to be in a soft state. So I annealed this piece of brass, cleaned it, pickled it, dried it off really well, and brushed it. The best way for you to absolutely destroy your rolling mill is to leave pickle on your pieces and run it through the rolling mill. That pickle is going to eat away at the steel of the rolling mill and rust it and leave pits in it. So always make sure everything is nice and clean and dry. Final thing I do is I'll go ahead and usually make sure and just wipe off any dust and dirt and grime before I go into this process. Little bits of dirt, little bits of sand, little bits of abrasive media from your bench or something can also harm the rolling mill. So I don't do this using any paper or cardboard or cardstock to protect the rollers. I just make sure everything is pristine and very clean. So again, this has been cleaned, pickled, brushed, rinsed multiple times to get all residues off it, and now we're ready to roller print. So I've got my rolling mill plate and my 18 gauge brass here. Again, this process works best with thicker metals, so 16, 18, 20 gauge is what I like to do. I'm gonna take my plate and my metal and I'm gonna open up the rolling mill until I can get this whole plate through, just like that. Now, what I am doing is I'm using the rolling mill to measure my stack. So I wanna crank the rolling mill down till it's pretty good and snug. And what this is going to tell me on this little dial right here is essentially the thickness that I have of my metal stack. So that's right at 37 on this little dial plate here. Most good rolling mills are going to have a plate like this. There are other ways to figure it out. So if you don't have a rolling mill that has this dial, let me know. All right, that's at 37. Now I'm gonna keep my hand on the dial here. I'm gonna open this up just a little bit, maybe a quarter turn, and I'm gonna pull my metal out, and I'm gonna go right back to 37. Again, that was my dead pass, and now I know that the spacing between the rollers is the same thickness as my metal. What I wanna do for our standard pattern plates is now decrease that spacing between the rollers by about 7 to 12 thousandths of an inch. That depends on your rolling mill. This one works really well at about 10 thousandths. So I'm gonna go from 37 to 47. So now the spacing is 10 thousandths of an inch less than my stack. Now essentially I'm ready to go ahead and roll this through. I'm gonna start my rolling mill. I wanna put my plate together and center it as much as possible in the rollers, and then we're just gonna go ahead and push it through. All right, and there you go. Have a nice impression on my plate. Good detail. And again, this technique is a form of coining. So if I look at that, the back is flat. There's nothing on the back, a slight texture, but really we have all our detail on the front side. This works best. Coining is always gonna work best with thicker metal. And it's going to give us two different sides. So again, I have nice texture on this side and I turn it to the other side and that is flat. All right, so a few more notes about this. These pattern plates are an order of magnitude softer than the rollers on the rolling mill. So it's safe to use these steel pattern plates from Bonny Doon in your rolling mill. Just make sure everything's nice and clean. Now, these plates can last a really long time. We've literally seen 1,000 impressions from one. To do that, the ideal thing is to roll a full-size sheet. So if you have a 2x6 pattern plate, you want to roll a 2x6 sheet. What that's going to do is going to spread the pressure out all over the plate, and it's going to make sure that it doesn't wear out in one spot. You don't want to just put thin, narrow strips on this and run a bunch through, because that's going to start to wear the plate in one area, and over time you're actually going to end up with a depression where that is. Another thing is every rolling mill is going to have a little bit of a skew when it goes through. That's an inevitable part of the rolling mill. Ideally, you want to get your plate as centered as possible in the overall roller, and that should give you the straightest plate. However, there's still going to be a little bit of a skew as it goes through. Using masking tape, using other, I've heard of people doing a lot of different stuff. I've never found any luck with any technique. I just make sure that I roll a piece of metal that's the full size as the pattern plate, and then I go and I cut out my design afterwards. So if you cut out like a ring blank, for example, and then you put it through here and run it through the rolling mill, it's gonna come out curved and it's gonna come out longer than it was when you put it in. So always roll your piece first and then cut out the final shape after that. Now from Bonny Doon, we have 3 different types of pattern plates. We have our standard pattern plates, we have our standard long pattern plates. These measure 9 inches long, so great for doing bangles and longer items. And then we have our extra fine pattern plates. So these have a much finer and more detailed texture on them or pattern on them. So if we go and look, what I just showed you on the rolling mill was for our standard pattern plates, which are going to be the 2x6s and then the long 9. So these have a little bit wider line and a deeper engraving. So when I'm running these on the rolling mill, I want to be using about 7 to 10 thousandths of an inch beyond that dead pass for getting the ideal impression on all of these. Sometimes on certain mills, you might have to go a little more than 10 thousandths of an inch. Now on our super fine pattern plates, you can see really nice fine detail in here. These work well with thinner metals, so as thin as probably 24, 26 gauge depending on the alloy. And these have a shallower engraving. So beyond that dead pass, I only need to go maybe about 5 to 7 thousandths of an inch deeper than the dead pass to get an ideal impression with these. All right, so that is all for pattern plates, both using them on the hydraulic press and using them on the rolling mill. Now, question still might be, what do you actually use this for? So I just wanted to go ahead and show you a couple of examples of pieces that were done on the rolling mill. This is a really nice texture on this Synclastic bracelet. Again, it's done in sterling silver and with a nice patina, anti-clastic shape. These were all done on the rolling mill. This piece here, again, nice hollow bead, and that was done on a hand engraved pattern plate. This was done with a extra fine pattern plate in 28 gauge silver. Nice and thin, really light hoop earring, just the right amount of detail and design to it. And then here's an old locket by Phil Poirier. Again, this was done with Kumbo, 23 karat gold applied, and then rolled through the rolling mill to create this really cool locket. And here we have a little pendant I made using stainless steel, silver, and niobium that was formed on a pattern plate. Mushroom formers and daps. This next technique we're going to get into is one of the more basic forming techniques where we are using domed steel formers and polyurethane to dome our pieces. Now we can use this for anything from creating a large domed box top, forming belt buckles, forming earrings and pendants and smaller pieces with this whole array of daps, mushroom formers. There is a huge array of domed sizes, of radiuses of forming that we can use for any piece we can possibly imagine. So let's go ahead. We're going to jump right in. I'm going to give you a little talk first about process, and we're going to form up some different gauges of copper to show you how the metal moves a little bit. So we're going to go ahead and use this 1.5" radius dap. Now again, these are all tools that are designed for use in the press. That is really important. Don't want to just be putting any old tool in there. These are 1-inch shanks and they fit into our master tool holder. Again, they are designed for use in the hydraulic press. So that just slips right up in there, and then I'm gonna go ahead and tighten that down. Now, when we're doing this, we want to use a container that's an appropriate size for what we're working with. So with this Daps set, I'm usually working with a 2-inch container. When we're working with the larger 3 and 4-inch mushroom formers, we're gonna go up to either this 3-inch contained urethane or the 4-inch contained urethane. So first off, I've got a piece of 18 gauge copper. This is 1.25 inch diameter. We're gonna go ahead and form this up. Quick note, anytime I'm pressing in urethane, I wanna make sure to deburr my metal so that it's not sharp. If I have really sharp edges on my metal, it's gonna cut the urethane and it's going to shorten its lifespan. So, got my 18 gauge copper, that's gonna go up here, and I'm gonna make sure this is all nice and centered. Now, we're just gonna go ahead and press until this urethane fully flows up around the former, ensuring that our piece is formed. And just like that, we have a beautiful, clean, seamless form. Now, one of the things I really like about doming pieces is it really changes the way that the light reflects off of the piece, it changes the way the light plays off of the piece, and it can make simple designs much more dynamic. Now, let's go ahead, and I've got a piece of 30 gauge copper. Now look closely when I'm doing this, and we're gonna show a little bit about how metal moves. So the thick metal formed up really nice and easy. Now the thin metal is going to wrinkle. I'm not gonna give it full pressure yet, but let me show you what it's doing. As I'm doming these formers, the outside radius of the piece is actually getting smaller. Now that metal needs to go somewhere. So with thinner metal, that metal is going to tend to wrinkle. With thicker metal, that metal is actually going to get thicker on the edges, and it's just one of the weird material properties. So if we're working with thin metal and we're having a lot of trouble getting these wrinkles, we can either work with thicker metal, or I'll show you here what we can do to help get rid of those. Since it's a constant radius, I'm just going to move my piece a little off center and press again. Now I'm just going around all the sides and getting rid of that. Still got a little bit of wrinkles here, but they're not that sharp. I want to keep these wrinkles away from forming a sharper than a 90-degree corner. Otherwise, they're going to be really hard to get out. That mostly got rid of the wrinkles, but not entirely. And that is just one of the difficulties of working with very thin metal and trying to do a small radius dome. So like I was saying, one of the things I really like about doming pieces or forming pieces is it changes the way that the light plays off of the surface of that piece. And it really makes for a much more dynamic quality for your jewelry. So you can take something that's relatively simple, give it a little dome or a little bit of an anti-clastic shape, and all of a sudden it really comes alive. So here we've got a small titanium earring, one of my designs, and flat, looks pretty good. Got nice guilloche engraving that catches the light, but let's go ahead and dome it and see how that changes. And also the beauty of the polyurethane is that it's not going to damage this engraving or the anodizing. Just going to put that right in the center. And we can see that that really accentuates the way the light plays off that engraving. All right, so using these Daps and mushroom formers is very simple. Keep it centered, use the polyurethane. Let's go ahead and form something that's a little thicker and a little more difficult using a large diameter mushroom former. Okay, so I have here this prototype belt buckle. Some things went wrong on it, but it's a really good example to show how we can form really complex pieces. 1/8" thick titanium that's been anodized and engraved. It would be really difficult to form this most ways. We're gonna form it up right now with this 4" former with a 4" radius. So that's an 8" diameter. Nice low dome, perfect for a belt buckle. This goes up in here, tightens down. And now I've got my large 4" container. This is gonna go in and I'm just gonna start at one side and I'm gonna press here and then I'm gonna move over and press here and then move over and press here and just slowly get that hole formed to it. And there you go. Have a nice, good shape to that. And again, that really makes the quality of the light much more dynamic, much more interesting. And this is going to be a belt buckle that fits really well. All right, so a few things I want to point out about this. The first is spring back. So depending on how thick of metal you're working with and depending on what alloy of metal you're working with, there is always going to be some degree of spring back. Something like 1/8" thick titanium is going to have a lot more spring back than, say, 20 gauge fine silver. So what spring back is it's the difference between the final form of your piece and the form of your former that you're using, the radius of your former. You can see here with this belt buckle that even though I formed it with a lot of pressure on the press, it doesn't completely match that. Now that's totally okay. I just want to choose a tighter radius former if I wanted to form this belt buckle more. In this case, this form is perfect for a belt buckle, so that spring back is totally okay. Another thing you can do with mushroom formers is actually form up larger vessels. So this was a 6" disc of copper that over about an hour, hour and a half, I used various diameters of mushroom formers to create this vessel. Now I'm going to go ahead and show you another way to use the mushroom former on the vertical vise, and we're going to do some texturing to this piece. So if you've got a vertical vise and you don't have a press and you still want to use mushroom formers, or if you just want to take pieces from the press and do some more handwork on them, we have this great Bracler and master tool holder adapter that works with our vertical vise. So first of all, I'm going to start by taking my master tool holder and I'm going to bolt this into this adapter bar. Just uses the exact same bolts from the press. Nice and easy. This goes together. And then this piece goes right into the vertical vise. It's got this nice sort of notch on the bottom that fits right into that and holds it very securely. Now I can go ahead and I can take my mushroom former and pop that in there and work by hand. So I could use, one of the Bonny Doon hammers with polyurethane to go ahead and form metal over that. In this case, we're going to be taking this bowl that I raised, or technically I sunk on the hydraulic press, and I'm going to go ahead and use this to go ahead and planish the exterior to give it this nice hand hammered texture. All right, so that's a wrap on today's video of the basics. Hopefully you come away with this with a greater understanding of how metal moves and a little bit of the different techniques. So again, a quick recap. First, what we did was using our pattern plates on the press, we formed our metal. Again, this is a process that works best with thinner metals, and we're using polyurethane to bend our sheet over the peaks and valleys of that die. Again, smaller surface areas, 1 to 2 square inches of thin metal is going to be what works best in this technique. Now, we went over to the rolling mill and we used thicker metal, and using the amazing pressure of the rolling mill, we actually coined our metal down into our pattern plate. So when we're working with this, we are limited to using slightly thicker metals. Of course, we have to use metals that are formable. Don't do this with stainless steel or titanium in the rolling mill or any other hard metals. We want to use formable alloys like silver, copper, brass, gold, etc. And coining, again, is we're using enough pressure that we are pushing the metal like clay. We're actually getting our metal to flow and the crystal structure to reorganize into this new shape. So it's going to be flat on the back and then have a cool texture on the front. Then we got into using mushroom formers and daps. Just nice, simple radius, but really can bring a lot of pop, a lot of liveliness to your pieces. Again, is also great for forming things like belt buckles, earrings, and pendants. And if we're doing fabrication work, we can dome like the top of a box and do some other cool things like that. So there's a lot you can do with that. When we are working with the mushroom formers and the daps, we want to remember that thin metal is going to gather and wrinkle. Thicker metal is going to gather and thicken. And it's just sort of one of the properties of how metal moves. So just be aware of that. If you're getting wrinkling on your piece, start with a less radiused former and then work your way down to that final shape and anneal every so often. In the next video, we are going to be doing a deep dive into the world of silhouette dies. A lot of fun stuff can be made with that. We can make our own dies, and we can use it for everything from creating hollow beads to hollow ware, large scale forms. So anyways, thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you again here very soon. Mushrooms and daps. Sorry, I can't do that.